Запад спровоцировал конфликт на Украине, на Ближнем Востоке, в других регионах мира и продолжает лгать.
For over 2 years now, Russia has been waging a full-scale war with Ukraine, a decision that has impacted the country on nearly every level. And the consequences of this decision are both long-term and far-reaching. So what are the biggest changes that took place in Russia since the conflict began? How long can Russia afford to wage this war? What's the state of its army, and can it still beat Ukraine on the battlefield? And can Russia's economy continue to bear the costs of this war? To answer these questions, we looked at the key areas where the biggest changes took place, what influenced them, and what we can expect in the future for Russia. A key question concerns the state of the Russian army and whether it's strong enough to beat Ukraine on the battlefield. When Russia began its military operation in Ukraine, it was counting on a swift victory and expected to overcome Ukraine in a matter of days. That turned out not to be the case. Ukrainian forces fought back, which caught the Kremlin by surprise.
Wypada przypomnieć, że Rosjanie przystąpili.
We should not forget that the Russians entered the war on the spur of the moment. They completely underestimated, indeed disregarded their opponent, the Ukrainian army, and underestimated the West, which from the very beginning of the conflict provided support, not only with arms supplies, but above all with reconnaissance in the broadest sense of the term. American intelligence in particular prevailed, and I assume still prevails, over Russian reconnaissance. The second of these cardinal errors was a mismatch between forces and operational needs. The Russians prepared as if they were going to a training ground. They fielded 150,000 soldiers against an already superior opponent. They treated Ukraine like some kind of colony to which one sends an expeditionary force to pacify it. When, in a matter of months, on a wave of great enthusiasm on the Ukrainian side, the Ukrainians mobilized a total of around 1 million troops by the summer of 2022, the Russians were stuck at 150,000 troops committed to this conflict the entire time. Well, maybe a few tens of thousands more securing the side of the Russian Federation. So this was a complete misunderstanding, and colloquially speaking, the Russians took a beating. They suffered the consequences of this unpreparedness, fled the front, retreating at an accelerated pace from the Kharkiv region. Later still, seeing that they were unable to hold on to right-bank Ukraine, they themselves withdrew from Kherson and from that part of the Kherson Oblast.
At the time, in the autumn of 2022, Russian leadership decided to conduct a so-called partial mobilization. By the end of the year, they had mobilized around 300,000 troops, which supplemented the losses in manpower and served as a basis for forming new units.
They also began to introduce a system of financial incentives of various kinds to attract people to contract service. They maintained the formula that young boys who go into basic military service are not sent to the front. Although there were cases where they did end up there, the Russians surprisingly tried to abide by this. It was the professional army, possibly volunteers, that went to fight.
The buildup of Russian forces continued throughout 2023. It involved both the replacement of soldiers in the units and the ongoing modernization of the Russian army. By the second year of the war, in January 2024, the Ukrainian army intelligence estimated that more than 500,000 Russian soldiers were stationed on the front line and in all Ukrainian occupied territory, including Crimea, more than 3 times the number with which they began the war.
Jeszcze w grudniu 2023 roku.
In December 2023, for the first time, information about the size of the so-called special military operation was provided by Vladimir Putin. He reported about the situation along the entire length of the front line and in the units which were securing this operation from various sides, logistically and in the Air Force and in the Navy. He said that a total of 617,000 troops were involved in this operation. Given the reports by the main Directorate of Intelligence of the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense on the Russian military presence in Ukraine, it can be assumed that Putin, for once, told the truth. We are also now already observing, according to recent statements by President Zelensky, even though he keeps claiming that Ukraine has a million-strong army, that there are 880,000 soldiers in this million-strong Ukrainian army. Although these are figures for the end of 2023 and this situation may have changed in favor of Russia, the Ukrainian advantage is visible. It is 2 to 3 in favor of Ukraine. The Ukrainian forces were estimated to have around 300,000 troops on the front line, while US intelligence estimated that there were around 200,000 Russians on the front line. The Russians stated their advantage all this time consistently not by numbers, as we are generally used to, but by firepower, by superiority, especially in artillery and the advantage they have in aviation, in missile systems.
Already in the spring of 2022, the war began to move to a positional stage, which continues till today, yet with caveats. Ukrainians exploited Russian weaknesses, like the Kharkiv region, where there was only one Russian defense line, poorly equipped and manned. Within one Ukrainian attack, the Russian unit retreated and later fled altogether.
I z tego Rosjanie wyciągnęli wnioski.
And the Russians learned their lesson after this, already when withdrawing from the right bank part of the Kherson region. In order to withdraw in a reasonably organized manner, they were already building up lines of first defense. At the same time, they had started to develop defensive positions, largely fortified, deeply embedded. These are at least 2 or 3 lines of fortification, and it must be stressed that such a line of fortification is several positions deep. The first line is trenches, fortifications and dragon's teeth. The second and third lines are bunkers. Sometimes there are 5 positions on one line, and there are dozens of kilometers between them. At the moment, the Donbass, the Zaporizhia region and part of the Kherson region are one big belt of fortifications. The Ukrainians are beginning to make up for this on both sides, but here it is already difficult to expect a breakthrough or to achieve any success. If both sides maintain a similar potential with direct attacks against each other, it will have more or less the same effect as the Ukrainian counter-offensive in the summer of 2023. This is similar to the well-prepared German and French units on the Western Front in the First World War.
The Russians no longer have problems with filling their ranks and recruiting soldiers, mainly due to an attractive financial offer. $2,000 per month and additional benefits are a very attractive salary for the majority of the Russian population. For many people, both young and old, joining the military became worth the real risk of death or serious injury. An attitude prevails that although others have been killed or injured, it won't happen to me, and I'll earn a lot of money. It's worth underlining once more that according to Western and Ukrainian assessments, over 500,000 people went into contractual service in 2023, in addition to a still residual mobilization.
Efektem, też jakimś potwierdzeniem tego jest
Some confirmation of this is provided by the subsequent decision. Recently it is more or less the President of the Russian Federation who takes such a decision on an annual basis, to increase the size of the armed forces of the Russian Federation, which reflects the existing state, and at present this is 1,320,000 troops, that is, over 300,000 more than in February 2022. Despite the incurred losses, however they are estimated, I am in favour of what the intelligence services already agree on and what was published at the end of 2023 by the US and British services, who provided the most details. That the Russian losses in manpower are only about 70,000 Russians killed as of November 2023. Together with the wounded who were injured in a way that prevented them from returning to service, that's in the range of something like 180,000 to 200,000. Those are the overall Russian losses. The same services estimate Ukrainian losses to be similar. Comparing them to the population, to the recruitment potential, these Ukrainian losses are far more severe than those suffered by the Russians.
These soldiers were incorporated into new units. The Russians created 2 new army commands and 2 new corps commands, and 4 new divisions are in various stages of development. Additionally, 1 division was created at the beginning of the war. Russia began expanding its military already in 2015 and accelerated significantly in 2022 and 2023. The expansion is in tactical military formations of the ground and airborne forces, where a new division is created, or rather recreated, the 104th Guards Airborne Division. Everywhere in these units, the Russians are switching to wartime stages. In peacetime, a classic armored or mechanized division had 3 regiments, 1 tank regiment and 2 mechanized regiments with infantry fighting vehicles. But for several years now, these units were already created in a wartime, meaning 4-regiment formation. Of course, in addition to these 4 regiments, there is also an artillery regiment and some support subunits. An average airborne division had 2 regiments before the war. Now they have 3. Most existing mechanized or tank brigades have been developed to a division level, and new divisions have been formed. Naval infantry brigades were developed to a division level, the most complicated in terms of equipment and training. The Russians have also created new artillery brigades and air force units. Changes have been taking place everywhere in the army, except for the Navy, where pre-war expansion programs are being continued.
Here is a small digression. These naval expansion programs should be seen as a kind of litmus test of the fact that the Russians can still afford both to wage war and to expand their army, because the Navy is involved in the conflict to a very limited extent, and its most expensive development programs, mainly the construction of new nuclear submarines, have nothing to do with the war in Ukraine at all. If the Russians really ran out of money, these would be the first to be reduced. So far, however, nothing of the sort is happening.
The expansion of the Russian military would not have taken place if the army, in addition to willing recruits, didn't have enough equipment. The majority of armaments which are sent to the front line or to newly formed units continue to be modernized weapons acquired from post-Soviet stockpiles. Tens of thousands of them are still at hand.
Jest podstawa, natomiast Rosjanie...
These stockpiles are the basis, and the Russians have also developed the production of new armaments. But it should be clearly emphasized that the new production does not cover all the needs of the Russian army. This is open to question, but I am not convinced that the Russians can cover their losses with new production, although in some arms categories, according to some Western intelligence services, for example in the case of armored weapons, the Russians are already able to cover their losses with new production. Recently, I think Estonian intelligence estimated Russian production capacity for tanks at 100 to 150 per month. This is a significant increase compared to the pre-war period. When it comes to the production of various types of armored weapons, it is an increase of up to 5 to 6 times compared to what the Russians were producing before the war. I'm rather skeptical of this data and suspect that this also includes upgraded units based on armament pulled from storage. In any case, nothing suggests that the Russians are suffering from a shortage of equipment, men, or any shell hunger. Right now we're at the turn of the second and third years of the war. The Russians unleashed this state machine and switched to a war mode mainly in the economy. And unfortunately they are gaining a certain advantage over the wider West, because without the West, Ukraine would not be able to fight this war.
Russia has unleashed its state machine and has effectively become a wartime economy. Russia's budget has ballooned since its full-scale invasion on Ukraine. This year, 6% of the GDP is planned for defense alone, 3 times the amount allocated in 2021 and 70% more than originally planned. According to official data, Russia noted a decline in GDP of 1.2%, while in 2023 it recorded a 3.6% growth. In 2024, the GDP of the Russian Federation is expected to return to pre-invasion levels. Annual inflation rates were 11.9% in 2022 and 7.4% in 2023, while the unemployment rate has fallen to 3%, its lowest level in 30 years. During wartime, macroeconomic data are not the best indicators of what really is going on in a country's economy. While the data might give a positive impression, the situation in Russia's economy is far from stable. Both the war and unprecedented sanctions imposed by the West change the way Russia does business. The economy can be viewed through 2 main sectors: the military, which concentrated the human production and capital resources, and the civilian sector, which has struggled to maintain production to meet consumer demand.
These positive macroeconomic growth were created mostly thanks to the huge public funds concentrated in the economy. According to the official estimation, around 10% of GDP was invested in the Russian economy during the last 2 years. Without this money, it will be very hard to maintain the GDP growth and in the same time to maintain the consumer demand.
The main question remains, how much is this war costing Russia? And while we have an answer, it's not a simple one.
According to official data from the Russian budget, around 40% of public spending, budgetary money, was dedicated to the war. But probably there was much more. We don't have a separate chapter in Russian budget which could give us information about the war spending. The main chapter, the main item in the budget, it's the national defense. In 2023, the amount of money, it was about $70 billion. It was around 80% higher than in 2021 before the invasion. We don't have data for 2022 because the Russian government decided to stop reporting this information.
War expenditure is hidden in other chapters of the Russian budget, such as the national economy and national security.
Except the Russian budget, also Russian regions and Russian companies, mostly the state-owned one, are forced to pay for the war. They have to, for example, pay for reconstruction of occupied territories, or, for example, pay for troops fighting in Ukraine front.
One of Russia's biggest challenges related to the war is the growing public spending to finance its military operation. The main task of the Russian government today is to continue to find funding for the war. Although we can't decisively say how long Russia can hold up, we do know that today it doesn't have enough current revenue to finance the war and is forced to use its reserves and increase its national debt.
We have to underline that despite growing fiscal burden, despite devaluation of ruble and ever higher inflation, still the current revenues are not enough to fulfill the needs for this war. The next challenge, of course, is shortages on the labor markets and weaknesses of human capital. Because of the war, a lot of young men were sent to the front line, and in the same time, a lot of educated and creative people have emigrated from Russia because they were afraid of mobilization or Kremlin's repression. And because of the problem on the labor market, because of the increasing cost of imports, the next challenges, it's inflation. And in the same time, the problems with balance of payment. Because of the sanctions, Russian companies have to pay for the costly imports in advance, mostly in hard currencies, euros or dollars. But in the same time, they get from its exports mostly non-convertible currencies. That's why we can say that nowadays there is a shortage of hard currencies on Russian markets, especially that Russia is still facing huge outflow of capital.
Russian companies need hard currencies to pay for imports that are necessary for the arms production sector and to fulfill consumer demand. At the same time, Russia also needs dollars to repay its national debt. Another obstacle for Russia's economy is overcoming the technical regression brought on by the war. Because of the outflow of foreign capital and investors from the Russian market, the country's economy will have problems to grow.
This is an interesting situation because the countries which are not joined the sanctions policy, like China, India or Turkey, are not interested to share its technology with Russia. In their view, Russia could be their potential market competitor. And in the same time, they also don't have such kind of technology. And without this technology, of course, development of Russian economy as a whole will be very problematic. Especially the most important sector like energy one, which is crucial for the stability of the whole economy.
The war and the sanctions will most likely continue to degrade the Russian economy.
After 2 years of this invasion, Russian reserves have been eroded badly. But on the other hand, thanks to the 20 years of oil prosperity, huge amount of money inflowed to Russian economy and to the Russian companies and Russian society. That's why still Russian government, Kremlin, has opportunity and possibility to pass on cost of this war on business and Russian society.
What we can say for sure is that financing the war will continue to be a priority for the Kremlin. Although it will be difficult to continue, we can expect that other government costs, such as the social or infrastructure spending, will be reduced to continue to meet the demands of a wartime economy.
We've already heard about some plans of Russian government to withdraw from some spendings like privilege mortgage program, which was a driver force for Russian construction sectors in the last few years. And we've also heard about some plans to increase tariffs for Russian households. The so-called turn to the east could in the future also be very dangerous for the Russian economy. Dependency on China and India, according to export of Russian oil, goods, but oil mostly, it also could reduce Russian revenues from this export, because both of these countries play dominant role on this market. That's why they can offer their own conditions of these relations with Russia. Of course, we don't know how Russian business will react on the situation which they are facing. When we look at the last 2 years, definitely they were concentrated on minimizing the cost of the sanctions and adapt to the new conditions, which was very helpful for Russian government and helped Russian government, Kremlin as well, to stabilize the situation. But nowadays they faced growing fiscal burden and growing obstacles for doing business, which reducing their profits. That's why we can expect, of course, growing tension between the Kremlin and business. Such kind of tensions could have political implications also, especially when it will come to the very important sectors, for example, like oil or gas.
The oil and gas sector were the main target of sanctions imposed in December 2022 in an effort to starve the Russian war machine. The sanctions imposed on Russia had several layers. They concerned Russian companies engaged in the oil and gas sector, such as producers and refiners of the product, as well as companies that were cooperating with the sector, such as traders and fleet operators. Another layer was an embargo on oil and fuel from Russia imposed by the EU and G7 countries, the strongest sanction on the sector. In addition, a price cap was imposed on Russian fuel and oil. Companies in G7 countries, while not importing the commodities themselves, can still engage in transactions involving Russian fuels and oil, such as transport and insurance, but only if the price of these commodities does not exceed strict price caps. For Russian oil, this is $60 per barrel. LNG processing was also heavily impacted by the sanctions. Western companies provided the necessary know-how for the process of its liquefaction, and with their departure, Russia struggles to replace the missing expertise. And this is a real threat to the development of this branch of its economy.
But, interestingly, gas is still not covered by the sanctions. The European Union didn't put an embargo on Russian gas. It still flows to a reduced extent, but it still flows to the European Union. Declaratively, the European Union wants to cut this dependence by 2027, but we are still seeing that the supply is still going on, right? And in that case, actually, it is quite interesting to see that Russians started to reduce the flow of Russian gas to the European Union, starting already in 2021. That was the attempt to influence European behavior politically, but it kind of backfired. We could see that they reduced the production by 120 billion cubic meters, the extraction of Russian gas in Russia. That's a huge amount. It has influenced the financial situation of Gazprom and the revenues coming with it.
Despite the ongoing war, Russian gas still travels to Ukraine. The contract regulating this cooperation was signed in 2019 between Naftogaz, the Ukrainian gas operator, and Gazprom.
But that contract expires by the end of this year, so presumably we will see another decrease when it comes to the supply of Russian gas to Europe. And we cannot forget that there is still LNG coming to Europe, to the European Union, to the terminals in Belgium, France, and Spain, and the Netherlands as well. And that LNG is transported by ships, right, by gas carriers.
In 2023, the revenue from the Russian oil and gas sector fell by 24% compared to 2022. We need to, however, remember that 2022 was a record year in terms of revenue, due to the very high global prices of these commodities. In 2023, the Russian ruble fell by 30% in comparison with the euro and dollar. These shifts make it increasingly difficult to reliably compare data and accurately assess the workings of the sanctions. Although, as a commodity, Russian gas wasn't sanctioned, the Kremlin attempted to limit its supply as a tool of political influence on the EU market. This, in turn, led to a decline in revenue for Russia's monopoly gas supplier and majority state-owned company, Gazprom. For many years, it has been a cash cow for Russia. Now, it's the main victim of the Kremlin's political calculation. The company is struggling to find a replacement for the European market, among other things, constrained by limited infrastructure.
The outlook for Gazprom is very bleak. But when it comes to the evaluation of the sanctions imposed on oil and fuel, then the situation is more nuanced, because the goal standing behind sanctions imposed on oil and fuel, Russian oil and fuel, was to decrease the revenues for the Kremlin, but also trying to avoid the distortion of the market. Therefore, the price cap its aim was to allow Russian oil and fuel to flow, but with a certain discount, what would allow the market to avoid the spike in prices. And that was achieved actually, because we can see the decrease of the revenues, but at the same time Russians adjusted themselves to the whole situation. The most notable sign of this adjustment is to what extent Russians exploited the so-called shadow fleet in exporting their commodity and fuels. They engaged traders and ship owners that doesn't have connections to the Western financial system. Therefore, they are free to go and they are free to export Russian production, right? So they exploited the opportunity when it comes to cheap Russian oil and sell it with certain premium.
The West still has room to maneuver when it comes to the sanctions. They could still be imposed on Russian LNG and to get rid of Russian supplies of pipeline gas.
Moreover, the United States is chasing a rabbit right now when it comes to sanctioning certain traders and certain ship operators that are engaged in selling Russian oil, violating price cap. So we can see that, for instance, it became a hurdle, it became an obstacle for Russian exporters to find a volunteering companies when it comes to ship operators, for instance. And hence, we could see that since the United States started to sanction certain ship operators, we could see that the discount on Russian oil grew a little bit in that regard. So we will see to what extent, whether there will be a political will, whether that sense of urgency to act will reappear again. When it comes to the prognosis for the Russian sector, there are certain factors that we should consider. First, the price of oil itself. If it will remain much lower than in 2023, Russians will have to deplete their national wealth fund, for instance, and the revenues will not be that high as it was in 2023. That will be a result of certain other elements, for instance, whether other countries would produce more oil and so on and so forth. Secondly, if the sanctions pressure would mount up, as I said, with another embargoes, with another companies sanctioned, the whole situation would get more complicated for Russians. Also, when it comes to gas, for instance, there is an element of uncertainty when it comes to whether Russian partners would be up to receive more gas. That is the most crucial when it comes to Chinese market. Chinese market is the only one that would allow Russians to kind of reorient their gas supply towards from Europe to China because of the size of the Chinese market. But we still do not know if and when Chinese would be eager to receive more gas than they do today. Also, another challenge lies in technological capability of Russian sector to adjust to the absence of Western technology. It mainly concerns LNG sector. Without Western technology, it is still uncertain whether Russians would be able to liquefy gas to the same extent and whether they will progress and will develop the whole sector.
When it comes to Russian policy, the last 2 years can be described as an acceleration of Putin's dictatorship. And one of the most alarming issues is an overtly neo-totalitarian cause adopted by authorities, clearly visible in certain spheres.
First of all, this is an unprecedented interference in citizens' private lives. It's mass censorship, it's mass digital surveillance, it's mass indoctrination. We also see unprecedentedly brutal repression against the regime opponents. And one of the relatively new tendencies is the attempt to isolate the regime opponents and political prisoners from the outside world. We are also witnessing the unprecedented harassment of the LGBT+ communities in Russia, allegedly in defense of Russian traditional values. LGBT+ movement, international movement, has been banned in Russia as extremist. And also the transgender persons have fallen victim to these traditional values. The war itself and this neo-totalitarian ideology or the attempt to impose the state ideology in Russia on the whole society are tightly linked, because the war is being presented as an existential defensive war against the West and everything that the West represents, including the system of values, the liberal democracy, and also tolerance for diversity. So to keep Russian society mobilized and rallied around the flag and around the leader, the Kremlin tries to impose this kind of state ideology, which is officially banned by the Russian constitution. But it has been done for at least several years now. And this is about a certain kind of brainwashing. And this is about raising new generations in this cult of the defensive patriotic war, in the cult of the leader, in the cult of the state, in the spirit of hatred against Ukraine, against the West, against everything that is not patriotic and different from what the state ideology presents as the only acceptable and politically approvable behavior of our mindset.
2 years into the war, the Putin regime is stable, even though events like the Prigozhin mutiny show that this stability can be fragile.
So far, the Kremlin has been quite successful in silencing and suppressing all kinds of anti-regime or anti-war sentiment among the public, using several methods. First of all, it's of course the unprecedented repression. Those people who dare to express their anti-war sentiment are usually detained, arrested, and convicted, sometimes for many years of imprisonment. And also we have mass censorship, so the artists, the journalists have been effectively silenced.
The Kremlin regime has ruthlessly repressed political opponents. Its recent victim is Alexei Navalny, the most recognizable and popular opposition leader. The circumstances of his death in a brutal penal colony in mid-February have not been fully disclosed. While both a political assassination or the extreme conditions of his prison sentences cannot be ruled out as likely causes, the responsibility of the Kremlin for Navalny's death is undeniable.
The Kremlin is also buying the loyalty of certain social groups. First of all, these are the beneficiaries of the seizure of assets from Russian private business and also foreign companies that are leaving Russia. And these people can make huge profits from these assets. This is in fact a creeping nationalization of the Russian economy, because everything that is officially nationalized and the property of the nation and state is in fact within the sphere of competence of Putin as the patrimonial leader, I would say, as the only person who has the right to distribute the assets. assets, and the ownership is of highly conditional nature in Russia. And these people know that their property rights are quite easily challengeable, so they will remain loyal to those who have offered those assets to them. Another group whose loyalty is being bought are those who fight in Ukraine or their families. These people have been offered unprecedented social status and also financial well-being. Many of them come from very poor regions, so they know that in any other system they wouldn't have what they have gained owing to the war, and also these people will not only remain loyal to the Kremlin, but they will be vitally interested in continuing the war until the ultimate victory, however this victory may be defined. Another group of the beneficiaries of the war is the widely defined state administrative apparatus, secret services, law enforcement bodies, and all groups linked to the military-industrial sector. So these people make huge profits, for example, on public procurement in the sphere of production goods and food for the army, but also for secret services and law enforcement bodies. This is a formidable, wonderful opportunity to repress people, to prove that they are necessary for the state, they are guardians of the domestic stability, but also their relatively new priorities connected with the war is to destabilize in every possible way the domestic situation in Ukraine, and also to weaken as much as possible the Western support for Ukraine.
We also have to ask, what might change in Russia after the presidential election?
This election will be rigged as any other election in Russia since mid-90s, I would say. We expect mass fraud again, this time, for the first time in Russia's history. The totally obscure and non-transparent internet voting will be employed in presidential election. This is a black box. This has been invented to make it relatively easy to organize the electoral fraud. If people vote through internet, and they are quite often forced to vote by internet by their employer, no one knows what happens with these votes. There is no possibility for any independent monitors to follow this process of counting internet votes. And this is much easier than just organizing the fraud offline. The mass offline fraud is always problematic, but the online fraud seems to be extremely easy. For the first time in his political career, Putin is running illegally because the constitutional reform that allowed him to run again and again and effectively continue in the presidency for life, this constitutional reform was conducted in blatant violation of the then binding constitution. After this election, Putin shouldn't be recognized as a legitimate leader of Russia. After the presidential election, we can expect further and more brutal and more massive repression. We can expect even harsher censorship and even harsher surveillance and even harsher indoctrination.
It can be safely assumed now that there will be no space for actions that do not fit the official state propaganda.
Now it's not enough to just remain silent and show silent loyalty and think whatever you want to think. The expectation from above is that you will actively get involved in supporting the regime, supporting its policies, and supporting the aggressive war. Everyone should be involved, and everyone should feel responsible and accountable, because this is also, in this political system, this is also a kind of guarantee that these people will remain loyal. There is a special term for that in the Russian language, krugovaya poruka. It comes from the mafia world, the criminal world, and it means that everyone has to be involved in illegal activities, because this is the guarantee that they will not rebel against their bosses, and they will feel persecution, so they will do anything and everything that is expected from them. The Kremlin still doesn't face the guns or butter dilemma, which means that it is able to finance both the military-industrial production and the high costs of the war, and to offer generous social transfers and high salaries in state-controlled sectors of the economy to buy loyalty of certain social groups. And as long as this dilemma is not on the Kremlin's agenda, we can expect further investment in the war, and we shouldn't expect any willingness to stop the war on Ukrainian terms. There is a growing war fatigue among the public, but at the same time, there is a quite strong belief in Russia's victory. This is stoked by the jingoist state propaganda. It's also stoked by the understanding that the Ukrainian counteroffensive has so far failed, that Russia still stands some chance of winning this war, whatever this victory can mean, because the war is presented to the public not as uniquely as the war against Ukraine. It's presented as an existential, eternal war against the entire West and NATO, which means that the prospect of the ultimate victory can be endlessly postponed into an indefinite future. It will allow the Kremlin to continue its repressive domestic political course, and also to put the growing burden, financial burden of this war on the citizens without possibly provoking any mass public discontent. There is a wide understanding both among the Russian nomenclatura and the public that time is playing in Russia's favor, and it's only the matter of time when Russia will achieve the ultimate victory. At the same time, they are afraid of starting any kind of internal discussions about the sense of the war and so on. They are afraid of being suspected of rebellion or disloyalty, because the punishment can be really harsh, including the death of such person, while they can still make profits from being loyal and from being a part of the system. They can make profits from the war and from the rampant corruption.
Sociological surveys in Russia show that the overwhelming majority of citizens support Putin as president in 2024. Almost 80% of those surveyed declare that they want him to become president again. And while this data cannot be fully reliable, it does reveal certain trends, one of them being the mass support for Putin.
People really don't see any alternative to him. And in the conditions of war, which is presented by the state as a natural condition of the society, of the country, they want to present the war as something normal, as something that is happening in the background. And in this way, they reduce public resistance to the war, and they send a signal that this is for a long time. So in these conditions, the public wants to cling to someone whom they know. They don't have to like Putin in order to support him, because he is the only one, he's the only leader without an alternative. So Putin runs as the only popular candidate, in fact. And this lack of alternative is one of the pillars of Putinism. And unless Russia loses the war in Ukraine, unambiguously, nothing will change in the system. Except for an ambiguous Ukraine's victory, any other scenario can be quite easily presented to the Russian public as the Kremlin's and Russia's victory, which in turn can block any kind of political change for a very long time to come.
Russia's foreign policy has undergone one of the greatest and most public shifts since the conflict began. The military strike against Ukraine marked a shift from a policy of masked revisionism to an open attack on the post-Cold War order using military force.
The major change in Russian policy was the break with the strategy that was adopted towards the West already by, let's say, late 1990s, or at the latest after President Putin's speech at Munich. This was a strategy that was composed of two elements. One was the competition and rivalry with the West, attempts to limit Western power and to limit especially the influence of the United States in the world system. This was conducted under the slogan of struggle for a multipolar world and putting an end to a unipolar American hegemony in the international system. But this was combined with a very intensive economic relationship with the Western economies, with the Western countries. So it was a double-natured strategy. But after 24th of February of 2022, this double-sided strategy has ended. In a sense, what we saw after 24th of February was the culmination of the anti-Western tendencies in Russian policy, feelings among Russian elite that Russia would not accept the results of the Cold War and would not be satisfied with playing kind of being a kind of normal superpower on par with other superpowers, which can play on par with the United States and has de facto a veto on American policies, especially as far as military interventions and especially as military actions, especially in the European Atlantic region. But after the 24th of February, Russian policy became openly hostile to the West, and basically Russian policy towards the West consists now of a kind of hybrid warfare type of strategy, meaning its aim is to weaken, divide the West and to put an end to the situation in which especially the US is a major factor in European security. So this is one major change, the switch from this double-sided relationship with the West to open hostility and open conflict. The second is, and it's a consequence of that, this is what Russian strategists call the pivot to the east, which in fact is also a pivot not only to the east but also to the south. Russian diplomacy concentrated on cultivating relationships with Asian and global south countries. If you look at the political contacts, there are two types of relationships that Russia is building. One is with countries that are sharing Russian anti-Western agenda, and these are countries like China, Iran, North Korea. With these countries, Russia is increasingly coordinating its diplomacy, continuing to develop ties in the military technical sector, clearly treating them as partners in its anti-Western crusade to create a new order in which the West would occupy a much more modest position, and in which there will be a new order built around non-Western institutions. So this vision has two elements. One is based on a true interpretation of UN Charter. So on a rhetorical level, Russia wants a system, an international system, which is based on the UN Charter. But on the other hand, it's building up various non-Western clubs and organizations that, according to its own rhetoric, are going to serve as framework for this new non-Western-centric international order. But also, as another element, a very careful cultivation of countries which are neutral in this Western Russian clash, which are not willing to join Western sanctions. You know? So Russia is not so much interested in countries coming out formally in support of Russian aims and Russian policies, and not necessarily sharing anti-Western agenda, but are actually willing to take advantage of the situation, namely the fact that Russia is seeking economic partners and is willing to provide countries with various possibilities for economic transactions that are there because of the limitations of economic exchanges between Russia and the West. So opportunities appear, the countries are willing to take advantage of it just for short-term economic reasons, irrespective, of the fact that Russia is committing gross violations of the UN Charter, conducting a war against its neighbor, openly annexing territory. So Russia is sort of playing to the worst instincts. One has to add that at the same time, Russia is trying to take advantage of anti-Western feelings and anti-Western resentments that exists in the global South and in the Western world. And this is an important element of how it's trying to sell its policy, and this is the sentiment that the Russian diplomacy is very good at exploiting.
Everything suggests that Russia's foreign policy course is set for the long term.
I think the tendencies are pretty clear. I don't expect any changes. These policies are logical from the point of view of objectives that the Russian leadership wants to achieve. They are really committed to this idea of cutting down the West to size, and they perceive this as being in their vital interest. They are in a way fighting for their survival. The only issue that's really worrying is a possibility of further escalation, which cannot be excluded. In the short term, I think this is not likely, because Russia now, its leadership feels that it's getting an upper hand against the Ukrainians. So any escalation doesn't make any sense. I'm talking about horizontal escalation in terms of trying to do something radical to force the West to stop its military and other type of aid to Ukraine. But since this aid is being limited for reasons that have nothing to do with Russia, and Russia is not interested in direct clash with Western forces at the moment, it would rather finish off the Ukrainian armed forces in isolation. The worry is that in the longer run, if the situation gets worse and the defeat of the Ukrainian forces is not happening, then there might be frustration and a return to thinking on the lines that one has to stop the supply of weapons to Ukraine, because without them Ukraine is not going to be able to defend itself, and for that one has to undertake radical actions to force the West to stop the supplies. But as I said, at the moment neither scenario looks realistic. But in the perspective of 1-2 years, there are reasons to fear that such scenarios might appear at certain moments as attractive for the Kremlin. And knowing what we know about its modus operandi, about its willingness to use force as a solution for various situations which are difficult, we're faced with crisis and cul-de-sac. The Kremlin tends to historically to use force, and the decision to attack Ukraine, both in 2014 and 2022, happened exactly in such circumstances.
In light of the challenges and shifts that Russia has undergone during these last 2 years, we can outline 2 basic scenarios for the future of the conflict. The first takes into account a significant reduction of aid in comparison with 2023 for Ukraine from the West, especially the financial support from the US. This could lead to a shift on the front line in Russia's favor, still in the summer of this year and before the NATO summit. Russia's political demands might be met by the Ukrainian government just because the cost of maintaining the fight would simply be too great to sustain. The problem with this is that such a solution does not solve the problem.
The Russian success and the peace dictated by Moscow in Ukraine, effectively meaning not only stripping Ukraine of further territories, but also, first of all, stripping Ukraine of effective sovereignty by Moscow. It will not end the bigger conflict between Russia and the West. It is highly likely that in such an event, Russia will issue demands for the West, for the NATO member states, along the lines of its draft proposals from December 2021, meant to establish a sort of a security buffer zone in Central Europe, also possibly encompassing a north of the continent. So, in a way, emboldened by success in Ukraine, Russia will start to negotiate from the position of strength, issue demands towards the neighboring NATO countries, and to somehow enhance its leverage, it will probably use increased hybrid warfare tactics, including cyber attacks, including further attacks on critical infrastructure, maybe some sabotage, subversion operations. And in the most dark scenario, it may also turn to use an active military force for a limited scale, probably, to have a sort of a limited military operation directed to one of the countries of the so-called northeastern flank of NATO, using also nuclear blackmail, in order basically to further enhance its position within talks and enforce its demands. But it will happen only if there will be basically a political breakdown of the unity of the Western community, a rise of transatlantic tensions and deepening divisions within NATO itself, inability to mobilize itself vis-à-vis the Russian threat. But there is still this second scenario, the positive scenario, in which we will mobilize ourselves. And not only this financial and military support for Ukraine will be provided, but also we will significantly increase our own military industrial capacity, also external purchases of equipment and ammunition for the purpose of supporting Ukraine, which will enable Ukrainians to effectively defend their land, to stabilize the front line at least in the next year or so, and in the most optimistic scenario, to allow Ukraine the next year to have a successful counteroffensive, liberating some of the further territories occupied by Russia, which again may lead Moscow to starting sort of negotiations about de-escalation, if not the freeze of the conflict.
Russia's message that they are ready to begin peace negotiations does not mean reaching a compromise with Ukraine. Peace on Russian terms means Ukraine's surrender and abiding to Russia's demands of denazification, demilitarization, and a neutral status of Ukraine. In practice, it means that Ukraine would be disarmed, partially dismembered, as Russia will most likely require to keep its conquered territories and perhaps even more. But most of all, it would concern establishing a pro-Russian government in Ukraine and dictating what policies it can convey. These are not demands that Ukraine or its allies are ready to support. So what would need to happen in order to have meaningful talks on Russia's withdrawal from Ukraine?
We need significant success of Ukraine in the battlefield, and to have it, we would need a significant mobilization of support and supply for Ukraine to allow that to happen possibly next year. So a lot will depend on the next months, next year, and what will be the political situation within the Western community, internal political situation and member states of NATO, including in the US, and to what extent not only our elites but also our societies will understand the stakes of this conflict. So that this conflict is not about any piece of Ukrainian territory. This conflict is about not only even European security, this is about the world order. And if we mobilize ourselves, if we really understand the stakes and dangers which lie there is a chance that we will really turn the tide and we'll have a more safer and better future.
Thank you for watching. As we publish this video, the presidential election in Russia is still taking place. If you want to learn more about it, click the link right here.